The small oak-paneled office of Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer, felt suffocating. Outside, a cool November rain slicked the windows of his downtown office, but inside, the air was still and thick with a different kind of dampness, the humidity of unspoken expectations. My brother, Mark, sat rigidly in his chair, his broad shoulders squared, a picture of a man ready to claim his prize. Across from him, our sister Sarah fidgeted with the strap of her designer handbag, her face a carefully constructed mask of somber respect that didn't quite hide the sharp glint in her eyes. I sat between them, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, feeling like a referee in a match that hadn't even started. Our father had passed 3 weeks prior, a quiet man of the earth who had built his life on hard work and simple truths. Now his final words were about to be read aloud, and the weight of his legacy hung in the air like the scent of old paper and leather. Mr. Thompson, a man with a kind face and a neatly trimmed grey moustache, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He began with the usual legal boilerplate, a monotonous recitation of clauses and conditions that did little to ease the growing tension. Then the real part began. "To my son, Mark, Mr. Thompson announced, his voice gaining a touch of gravitas, "I leave my John Deere 8R 410 tractor, along with all the modern farming equipment purchased in the last decade." A flicker of pure joy crossed Mark's face, his lips curling into a triumphant smile. He had always seen farming as an industry, a means to an end, and that tractor, a beast of steel and technology, was the embodiment of that vision. "I'll sell it to a collector," he'd whispered to me once. "It's worth a fortune." "To my daughter, Sarah," the lawyer continued, "I leave the remainder of my savings, currently valued at $75,000, and the farm's residential property, including all furniture and appliances." Sarah's smile was less a grin and more a subtle, satisfied purse of the lips. The residential house was new, a modern structure our father had built to appease her urban sensibilities. It was her ticket out, a nest egg she had always craved to escape the very soil that had nurtured her. Finally, Mr. Thompson turned his attention to me. "And to my son Jake," he said, his gaze settling on mine with a peculiar warmth. "I leave the 150 acres of prime farmland and the old, dilapidated barn." A moment of stunned silence hung in the room, then a low chuckle began to rumble from Mark's chest. It started small, a cough, and then erupted into full-blown, boisterous laughter. Sarah joined in, her elegant laugh a sharp, mocking sound. "The barn?" Mark scoffed, wiping a tear from his eye. "The rotting piece of wood and rust that a stiff breeze could take down? What a joke!" I felt a hot flush of shame and fury spread across my face, but I held my tongue. I knew my father, and I knew there was no joke. I stood up, shook Mr. Thompson's hand, and walked out into the rain, leaving the sound of their laughter to echo behind me. They had chosen the temporary. They had chosen the easy way out. I was left with the land, the potential, and the true heart of my father's legacy. The moment I stepped out of Mr. Thompson's office and onto the rain-slicked sidewalk, the world seemed to shift. The weight on my shoulders wasn't a burden. It was a silent, profound responsibility. The distant sound of Mark and Sarah's mocking laughter was now just a muffled hum, drowned out by the gentle pitter-patter of the rain. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a quiet resolve settling deep in my bones. They saw a joke. I saw a promise. I drove out of the city, the skyscrapers giving way to rolling hills, and then, finally, to the familiar, sprawling landscape of our family farm. The rain had softened to a fine mist that clung to the fields, giving the whole scene a melancholic, ethereal beauty. My eyes immediately fell on the barn, an old weathered structure of greying wood and a roof that sagged like a weary shoulder. It stood in stark contrast to the modern house and the gleaming empty fields where the John Deere tractor no longer stood. I walked the perimeter of the 150 acres, my boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. This was more than just land. It was a canvas. My father hadn't given me a finished product. He had given me a project, a challenge. He knew Mark would sell the tractor for a quick profit, and he knew Sarah would spend the savings on a life far away from the soil she never loved. They had chosen things that depreciated, things that were easily spent. I was left with the foundation, the one thing that would only ever increase in value. The land was an investment in a future I would have to build myself, with my own 2 hands. The knot in my stomach from the lawyer's office was gone, replaced by a deep ache in my heart that was half grief and half fierce determination. My father had seen something in me that my siblings couldn't, a connection to the land that ran deeper than money or ambition. He had seen a part of himself reflected in me. This wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about honoring his choice, his faith. As I stood there, a solitary figure in the vast silent field, I made a silent vow to my father. I would restore the barn, revive the land, and turn his quiet legacy into a vibrant reality. My first few weeks were a brutal, solitary crash course in agricultural reclamation. The fields, once a source of our family's livelihood, were now a mess of tangled weeds and nutrient-poor soil. I spent my days pulling at stubborn roots and my nights poring over dusty books on sustainable farming. My hands, once accustomed to the simpler tasks of my old life, were now perpetually calloused and caked with dirt. The barn was a beast of its own. The roof was a patchwork of holes, sunlight and rain slicing through the gaps. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of decay and a layer of dust that seemed to have been accumulating for centuries. A family of raccoons had taken up residence in the upper loft, their beady eyes glinting in the dark corners as I tried to assess the damage. It was a project that seemed almost impossible, especially without the modern equipment my brother now owned. I was at a crossroads, overwhelmed and a little lost, when a lifeline appeared in the form of my childhood friend, David. He was a local mechanic who had a passion for vintage machinery. He found me one afternoon, covered in dirt and frustration, trying to pry a rusted nail out of a plank. "Jake," he said, a grin spreading across his face as he took in the state of the barn. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you." David didn't just offer moral support, he offered his expertise. "I remember your dad had an old tractor tucked away somewhere," he said, and together we scoured the back of the barn, unearthing a rusty but sturdy Ferguson TE20 from under a pile of old tarps. It was a far cry from a John Deere 8R, a humble, almost antique piece of machinery. But with David's help, we spent the next 2 weeks tinkering, cleaning, and repairing. With a triumphant roar, the old engine sputtered to life. It wasn't powerful, and it was certainly slow, but it was mine. It was a testament to our friendship and my own stubborn refusal to give up. With that little tractor, I began the long, slow process of clearing the fields, one small, painstaking row at a time. The work was grueling, but with every turn of the soil, I felt a connection to the land growing stronger, a sense of purpose deepening with every drop of sweat. The autumn rains turned to the sharp bite of early winter, and the cold made every task a little harder. One afternoon, seeking a break from the biting wind, I retreated into the barn's dusty office, a small room in the corner that my father had used for his paperwork. I was replacing a section of rotting floorboard when I felt something give way. Prying it up, I discovered a small weathered wooden box hidden in the crawl space beneath. Inside, nestled among a few old photos and a worn-out map of the property, was my father's journal. It was filled with his neat, spidery handwriting, chronicling the daily struggles and small triumphs of farm life. As I read, a different side of my father began to emerge. He wrote about his growing frustration with the industrial-scale farming he was forced to practice to stay afloat. He detailed his secret dream of transitioning to organic, sustainable farming, a gentler approach that respected the land, but that required more time and an investment he never had. But then, I turned a page and saw an entry that stopped my heart. "The old barn," he had written. "It's more than just a storage space. The view from the loft with the sun setting over the fields, it's magic. I've always imagined it as a place for people to gather, to celebrate. A wedding venue, maybe. They're not looking for a fancy hall, they're looking for an experience. That barn, in the right hands, could be a treasure." A jolt of pure revelation shot through me. I didn't have to compete with Mark's high-tech, fast-paced farming model. My father had already given me the blueprint for a different path. The land could be my organic farm, a slow and deliberate process, but the barn could be something completely new. It could be an event space, a place where people came to celebrate life's milestones, surrounded by the very land my father had loved. The idea was audacious, but it was the only one that felt right. It was a vision that was both a tribute to my father's memory and a future I could build for myself. I realized in that moment that my siblings had seen the farm as a simple asset to be sold, but my father and I saw it as a story waiting to be told. The revelation from my father's journal was the catalyst I needed. The barn was no longer just a dilapidated structure. It was the heart of a new business venture. With David's help, we began the monumental task of restoring it. Money was tight, so we had to get creative. We salvaged old planks from a fallen oak on the property to replace the rotting floorboards. I learned to mix concrete and mortar, carefully mending the cracked foundation. The work was slow and meticulous, a far cry from the quick-fix, high-tech farming my brother now likely practiced. During this time, the phone calls from my siblings dwindled. Mark was preoccupied with a new business venture, a get-rich-quick scheme he'd invested in with the proceeds from the tractor sale. Sarah was busy navigating the competitive world of New York, her voice becoming more distant with each call. They saw my life as a regression, a step back into a past they had eagerly left behind. They had no idea I was building a new future. I began my new farming model on a small patch of land behind the barn, using my father's journal as a guide. I started with specialty vegetables, heirloom tomatoes, exotic varieties of kale and vibrant peppers, the kind of produce that local chefs would pay a premium for. The first harvest was small, a modest yield of bright, beautiful vegetables. I took them to the local farmers' market, nervous and unsure. The response was incredible. Customers were drawn to the unique varieties and the genuine passion behind the product. The demand was far beyond what I could supply. My father's words echoed in my mind. "It's not about the quantity, son, it's about the heart you put into it." I was putting my heart into every seed, and it was beginning to show. The farm wasn't just a place to grow crops. It was a testament to quality, care, and a new way of thinking. Just as the barn's restoration began to feel like a two-person job that needed a small army, an unexpected ally arrived. Emily, a girl I had gone to high school with, was back in town after years of working in a big city landscape architecture firm. She'd heard about my project from David and came to the farm one afternoon, a sketch pad in her hand and a wide, hopeful smile on her face. "Jake, this is incredible," she said, her eyes sweeping over the barn with an artist's appreciation. "The lines, the natural light, the way it all sits against the fields, it's perfect." Emily didn't see a rundown barn. She saw potential, just like I did. She saw the rustic charm and the raw beauty. She immediately began sketching out ideas. A cobblestone path leading to the barn, a small flower garden for weddings, a designated area for outdoor seating under a canopy of string lights. Her vision was a perfect complement to mine, adding a layer of professional design to my heartfelt, hands-on work. Emily didn't just give me ideas. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She helped me create a beautiful garden that was both a scenic backdrop for events and a source of fresh herbs for my produce stand. We spent long hours together, talking about our dreams, our shared love for the countryside, and our memories of my father. Her presence not only lightened the physical load, but also filled the quiet emptiness of the farm. We were no longer just two people working on a project. We were two people building a dream together. Her support became the foundation of everything I was creating. The barn, once a symbol of my solitary struggle, was now a symbol of partnership, shared vision, and the power of community. The day of our first event was a crisp, clear Saturday in late spring. A local couple, who had been captivated by the barn's unique story and rustic charm, had booked it for their small, intimate wedding. I had spent the entire week in a state of nervous anticipation, making sure every detail was perfect. The barn, with its newly polished wood, elegant string lights and fresh flowers arranged by Emily, looked magnificent. The loft, where I had once found a family of raccoons, was now a stunning space with large windows that framed the endless fields. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange, pink, and gold, the ceremony began. The couple stood in front of the massive barn doors, their vows carried on the gentle breeze. I watched from a distance, a lump forming in my throat. This wasn't just a business, it was the realization of a dream, my father's dream. The laughter and music that filled the air were a far cry from the silence I had faced just a few months prior. After the ceremony, the bride, a woman with a genuine, heartfelt smile, approached me. "Thank you, Jake," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This place is exactly what we wanted. It's so much more than a venue. It feels like a home. It feels like magic." Her words were the true measure of success. The following weeks brought a flood of inquiries and bookings. Word of mouth was spreading like wildfire. My organic produce was selling out faster than I could grow it. I had transformed a neglected piece of land and a forgotten barn into a thriving business. And the true reward was not just the financial success, but the emotional fulfillment that came with it. The success of the farm became the talk of the town, not just for the beautiful events, but for the story behind it. The local paper ran a feature on the Barn of Dreams, detailing my journey and my father's quiet vision. Photos of the stunning venue and my organic produce filled the pages, a stark contrast to the small one-line mention of my brother's failing business venture in a financial section a few weeks prior. One crisp autumn morning, as I was loading fresh vegetables into my truck, a familiar car pulled into the gravel driveway. It was Mark and Sarah. They looked different from the confident, laughing people who had walked out of the lawyer's office. Mark's posture was slouched, his face etched with worry. Sarah, dressed in a faded old sweater, had a defeated look in her eyes. The easy money had run out, and their dreams of escape and fortune had turned to dust. The John Deere tractor had a catastrophic engine failure, a costly repair that Mark couldn't afford, and his business venture had collapsed. Sarah's high-flying life in New York had been unsustainable, a house of cards built on the last of her inheritance. They watched me work for a moment, their silence speaking volumes. "We saw the article," Mark finally said, his voice flat. "We were foolish, Jake. We're sorry." There was no triumph in me, only a deep sense of sadness. They had been so fixated on the shiny new things that they had completely missed the true value of what our father had left behind. They had sought the easy path, and now they were left with nothing. I invited them inside, not with a sense of "I told you so," but with a simple, genuine kindness. We sat in the kitchen, the same one our father had sat in for decades, and the silence was heavy with their unspoken regret. I didn't offer them money. I didn't gloat. That wasn't my father's way, and it wasn't mine. Instead, I gave them something much more valuable, a chance. The next morning, Mark and Sarah came back, not as supplicants, but as people ready to work. They didn't ask for a handout. They asked for a task. Mark, with his inherent knowledge of mechanics, began helping me with the farm equipment. He spent days tinkering with the old Ferguson, his hands greasy, his mind focused. The frustration and bitterness he once carried were slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. He found fulfillment in the quiet hum of a well-oiled engine, not the roar of a high-tech machine. Sarah, with her keen eye for aesthetics, was a natural at event planning and decor. She worked with Emily, her creative flair bringing a new layer of elegance to our barn weddings. She found joy in arranging flowers, in the careful selection of a tablecloth, in the small details that made our events so special. She had found a new kind of beauty, one that was authentic and rooted in the very land she had once been so eager to escape. We were a family again, but not by obligation. We were a family bonded by a shared purpose. Our father's legacy was no longer just my responsibility. It was a collective one. Mark and Sarah were finally beginning to understand what my father had intended, that the true wealth wasn't in the possessions, but in the effort, the work, and the love we put into creating something meaningful. The land had not only healed itself, but it had begun to heal us as well. 2 years had passed since that tense, silent day in the lawyer's office, and the transformation of our family's farm was complete. It was no longer just a piece of land. It was a vibrant, thriving ecosystem of business and community. The barn, once a symbol of neglect and decay, was now a stunningly rustic and sought-after event venue, its calendar booked solid for the next 2 years. Our fields, meticulously tended with organic principles, were yielding bountiful harvests that had made our produce a staple in the menus of the region's most respected restaurants. The financial success was undeniable. We had already cleared well over $250,000, a number that once seemed impossible. But as I'd come to learn, the money was merely a consequence, not the goal. It was the byproduct of a greater treasure we had unearthed. One warm summer evening, as the sun began its slow, majestic descent over the rolling hills, I stood with Mark and Sarah on the newly built deck of the barn. Below us, a wedding reception was in full swing. The air was filled with the gentle, rhythmic hum of music and the joyful chatter of guests, all bathed in the golden, honeyed light of dusk. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated happiness. Mark, who once scoffed at the land and its old, rusty tractor, now looked out at the fields with a newfound sense of peace. He pointed to a section of the perimeter fence, his face creased with a proud, contented smile. "I reinforced those last week," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet pride I hadn't heard from him in years. "They'll hold up for decades." He was no longer looking for a quick buck. He was invested in permanence, in a legacy that would last. Beside him, Sarah was a blur of motion, putting the finishing touches on a centerpiece on a nearby table, a beautiful arrangement of wildflowers and heirloom vegetables from our own garden. Her hands, once accustomed only to the delicate strap of a handbag, moved with a newfound grace and confidence. She caught my eye from across the deck and smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was a smile that said she had found a true sense of purpose, not in a bustling city, but in the very soil she had once been so desperate to leave. In that moment I saw them not as my rivals, but as my partners, standing on the very ground they had once dismissed. My father had given them the easy path, the instant gratification of a new machine and a bank account, and it had led them to a dead end of regret and disillusionment. To me, he had left the hard road, the long, arduous path of dedication, struggle, and honest labor. But in the end, that hard road had not only led to a place of financial security and success, but more importantly, to a place of true fulfillment for all of us. My father's legacy wasn't just the land or the barn, it was the trust he had placed in me. A trust that I had not only honored, but had made bloom into a new life for our entire family. The greatest treasure, I realized, wasn't in what you inherit, but in the purpose you find, the family you rebuild, and the enduring passion you pour into building something lasting with your own hands. If Jake's journey and his family's story have moved you and made you reflect on the true meaning of legacy, then you're in the right place. Subscribe now for more stories that celebrate resilience, family, and the power to turn challenges into life-changing opportunities.